So I posted a video yesterday about some basically reacting to JD Vance on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, talking about the Ten Commandments, defending the I forget the exact what exactly the bill does, but the bill out of the Texas state legislatures that it's been adjudicated a bunch. I think last Fifth Circuit upheld that they could post the Ten Commandments in their like specific King James version, and like with like very specific details about like the size of it and how it was to be displayed. Um, but like displaying the King James version of the Ten Commandments in Texas public school classrooms has been upheld by a federal court. And I got a couple things wrong there. I made a reference to a story about Lot and his daughters getting him drunk and having sex with him to continue his line. I incorrectly said that was in Exodus. It's actually in Genesis 19 to be specific, I believe. But the other part about the different treatment of like female slaves versus male slaves and Israelite slaves versus foreign warplane slaves, that all is true. And that stands. And then there was another thing I made a joke about JD Vance being a born again Catholic. And this is what happens when you don't write these things down. But basically what I was trying to get at is he comes from this sort of evangelical Southern Baptist convention inspired. I don't know if what denomination or lack thereof he would have associated with, but I will say that the overwhelming majority of American Protestant Christianity that that exists in the political space in particular is heavily influenced by Jerry Falwell's 1980-ish moral majority. And basically, it's all about a response to Roe versus Wade and desegregation. And J.D. Vance left that tradition, but I don't think we ever really leave the traditions that define our youth. And as I mentioned, he's about 10 years older than me. He's like 40 to 45, somewhere in there. And I've heard the tradition that he grew up in, described different ways, but I think it certainly, even my Episcopalian upbringing didn't completely insulate me from the born again evangelical stuff that was just sort of floating around in all of the Christian media of the time. And it's interesting that JD Vance became basically he describes going through an atheist phase, I think, in college, which is super common. But actually one of the biggest things that leads people away from the faith is the conflation of politics and the faith. And what's interesting now is that you'll hear people like Josh Howard talk about, you just can't preach in these liberal cities anymore. Liberals are just so antagonistic towards the gospel. And really what has happened is that the people that are going out of their way to evangelize have basically limited themselves to an interpretation that does not include, what Jesus referred to as the weightier matters of law in Matthew 23:23, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. They basically narrowly define faithfulness as believing in their specific traditions regarding inerrancy and specific interpretations of what it means for the Bible to be divinely inspired. And if you don't agree with them, well, then you're not a Christian. And a lot of people who would otherwise have been Christian said, okay, I'm not whatever you are. You guys seem to have a monopoly on who gets to define themselves as Christian. I guess I'm not Christian anymore, and have gone a different way. And sort of the remnant that remains, they love using that term, by the way, the people that remain in the church are people that were okay with all of that. They sign on the dotted line. And to some extent, it's the people that were willing to sell their soul for political reasons, to help enable themselves. Let me see if I can take that again. They are basically people that are okay with their faith being subservient to political expedience. That's who has remained most uh, spiritually, emotionally invested in the churches, not universally. The main lines are dying, but they're not necessarily all dying equally. And the church I grew up in is doing a good job of modernizing their worship and borrowing aspects of non-denominational um, churches to make it more appealing to young people. But the sort of evangelical Baptist and non-denominational space really has taken on a very market-based, almost like a franchise method, where if you go into non-denominational churches across the country, you're going to see a lot of the same thing. You're going to see a couple songs, not a lot of reading from the scripture, very long sermon. 40, 45 minutes is not uncommon. And really, not a lot of the stuff that we have in the mainline church I grew up in, where there's a reading, there's like three or four reading every single Sunday, and it goes in sort of a cycle, and it's limiting in the sense that you can't really have a pastor preach on what's happening, that what the congregation is experiencing in the same way you can in a non-denominational church, where they just get to preach about whatever they feel like. And they'll kind of, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll go through like the book of Acts, chapter at a time or something. And that'll be like, maybe I don't know exactly how long the book of Acts is, but they'll go for a couple months, worth preaching out of the same book of the Bible. And that can be useful, actually. I do, there's certain aspects of that I like, but I think one reason that JD Vance, I called him a born again Catholic. And the reason I say that is because he comes out of the evangelical tradition, rejected it during college, and then for whatever reason, I can speculate about the sort of trad cath movement, the importance that movement has on the online right that JD Vance is very much a part of. And he's a conspiracy theorist by his own admission. And I think a lot of the Nick Fuentes, right? Nick Fuentes also being like one of the most prominent trad Caths or traditional Catholics in the online space, that JD Vance is also spending probably an unhealthy amount of time in. They don't emphasize the born again experience, but it's pretty simple. The Catholic Church is pretty darn similar liturgically to the Episcopal Church that I grew up in that there is sort of a formula to it, and it's got deep roots in a way that the non-denominational church, they'll point to the Bible and they'll be like, oh yeah, we believe in the Word of God. We go back to the Bible, and the Catholic Church actually, because of their certain aspects of how they developed got away from the true word, and we understand what it really means, when that's just window dressing to cover for the fact that their church is, like, honestly not even 50 years old, really, because most of that really has its roots in, like I said, the moral majority of the 1980s. And a lot of the non-denominational space, um, one place that it sort of overlaps with the Catholic Church a little bit, the Catholic Church doesn't really talk about spiritual warfare in the same way that, the very NAR influenced non-denominational spaces do, because fundamentally the non-denominational spaces is the Christianity that sells, and the easiest people to sell Christianity to are young men who don't have a sense of identity, of who they ought to be, of what they ought to strive to do. Basically, they don't have anything organizing their life. And JD Vance maybe isn't quite at that phase in his life still that he would have been in when he was 20, and that a lot of men of roughly 16 to 25, what in maybe 5-10 years ago would have been like peak peak Andrew Tate demographics. By the way, he just got arrested in the U.S. for some crimes that he allegedly, I guess, committed in England. I will say that the crimes that he's committed in England seem a lot like, or allegedly committed in England, feel a lot like the crimes that he allegedly committed in a lot of other places. But that's kind of an aside. JD Vance is sort of like the spirit animal. He's like a more rhetorically evolved version of the young man who doesn't have a sense of his place in life. And, people give him shit for changing what his name is, like, changing his last name to Vance in honor of his grandmother. And I just think that, in one sense, he's a tragic figure. He's had all these experiences because his mother was on drugs and brought different men around him at different points. And, his grandmother, even though he's very appreciative of what she did for him, seems like she was not a very easy person to live with in many ways. Um, but you know, at this point, he's like 45 years old, and he just reinvented himself. I call him a born again Catholic because he's one. There's this joke that's very familiar to anybody who grew up in a Christian space. Um, the zeal of the convert. A lot of times, people will have their born again experience in these evangelical spaces, and for them, it's very meaningful because it represents a break with who they were before. They get to sort of reinvent themselves. And, if the sins of the father are visited upon the subsequent generations, the sin of your past self definitely are visited upon your future self. And it takes a lot of work to make a clean break with who you used to be. And very few of us actually are willing to do that work. And even if we are willing to do that work in one area of our life, we're very unlikely to do it in sort of a holistic, like apply the same logic to all of the areas of our lives. And we're very unwilling to, in most cases, break with what we were before. And, you know, I haven't read JD's second book, or I don't know how many books he's actually written. I haven't read the most recent one. The only one of his books I've read is Hillbilly Elegy, and there's a lot in there to like. Like when he's talking about how there was something he wanted to do, and he needed a recommendation from the governor, and he basically was like, "Well, shit, I don't know the governor. I guess I can't do this." And the woman he was dating, who I think is Usha, although I'm not 100% sure about that, um, who basically was born into wealth and knows how to navigate these things. It basically walks him through. Oh no, you don't need to know the governor. You got into this big fancy school. He's going to give you a recommendation. You just need to like basically fill out a form. I mean, you need to send him like an email or send him a letter or something, and he'll give you the recommendation. Like exactly the kind of your resume is the kind of resume that gets people this recommendation. It's not about a personal relationship. But like he talks about how he didn't know that. Coming from where he came from, that was just the kind of thing you didn't learn. And like, I don't have family who's from Ohio, but I have family that, he traces his lineage back to some holler in Kentucky. I trace my lineage back to a holler in West Virginia. It's the same kind of deal. And so I get a lot of where he is coming from and the how he traces his lineage and the sort of mythology that he creates around that. It's very, very familiar because as a younger man, I went through a time where I based my identity on a place that I really didn't come from. Like, my grandparents were there. We went to see them a lot. I learned a lot from them, but that's not where I came from. That's where my father came from. That's where my grandparents came from. I grew up in the suburbs. I mean, technically, I was born in an area and lived in an area that was a lot more rural up until I started being able to remember things. My parents were like, "Well, this is not a great place to raise a kid," and they moved. But I say all that kind of to say this: JD Vance, in a lot of ways, feels very familiar to me because there's a lot of parallels in his life. He had a much harder life than I did, but a lot of the mythology around who he considers himself to be is very familiar because I've told myself similar stories. But it's worth remembering that just because a story is meaningful to you doesn't mean that you haven't created a myth of who you are that is useful to you, something that you might call useful fiction about where you came from and who you are. And for someone like JD Vance who seems to reinvent himself, Hillbilly Elegy made him the darling of the left wing for a while, or he ultimately pivoted from saying Trump is, you know, America's Hitler to saying Trump is the best thing that's ever happened to America and he's going to make America great again. And, I just, I think that watching someone like JD Vance is instructive, but you have to be careful because the same way that, you know, I keep going back to Matthew 23, maybe too much, but the same way that Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for basically saying, you guys follow the law, but you ignore the weightier matters. JD does a really good job of making rhetorically complex arguments that are internally consistent but often rely on false information or affirm people's emotional states without giving them, like, attending to the weightier matters of like what the actual truth is, and actually having any sense of like what it means to be just, and really just, I mean, we call it in the left wing context speaking your truth. And JD Vance is someone who I'm sure would speak derisively about that kind of thing, and yet here he is, out here speaking his truth. And I can't help but feel a little bit bad for a guy who clearly he has all the hallmarks of getting bullied as a kid. And I've heard people call him an Ozempric, and I think, I don't know exactly how he lost his whatever weight he lost, and I will say I think the beard is a good choice with that chin, but I also do feel genuine like pity for him in a lot of ways, even though he's a man who's been far more successful than I will ever be. If he doesn't do anything else with his life, I mean, I will never get 1/10 of the power that he has as vice president, and yet I feel sim for him, but the Bible talks about wolves in sheep's clothing, and I think that it's very important when we're talking about any politician to keep in mind that many people who wear the clothing of faith are inwardly ravenous wolves. And I think maybe JD Vance is a little bit more transparent about that than most, but every one of these people is a learning experience that can teach you how to interpret other people who are better at, you know, wearing the clothing of the sheep while inwardly being a ravenous wolf. Anyway, that's how I see it.